First, though, a look at how automation will affect a major industry here in Minnesota and across the U.S. I'm talking about the world of jobs by which people make a living driving. In December, in those weeks when the transition in the White House was getting all the attention, a report came out from the Obama White House, one of their final economic reports, and it estimated nearly all truck delivery and taxi jobs will be automated. That means some 3.1 million people could lose their jobs. Could is the big question mark here. We'll have some more numbers in a moment about how substantial this is, but first let's bring in two guests to discuss this and what to do about it. And I want to hear from you as well. John Hausladen is president of the Minnesota Trucking Association. Hello and welcome.
Yeah, good morning, Tom.
Steve Viselli is an economic and political sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. Steve, thanks so much for your time.
Hello, Tom. Hi, John.
Good morning.
Your experience as well. Are you a truck driver, big rig, delivery truck? Maybe you're a taxi or other driver. How do you see automation in your work, and what are your thoughts on how to address it? 1-800-242-2828, 651-227-6000. You can tweet me at WeberTom1. And yes, we're talking about driving, but please don't call or text if you are driving. Pull over if you can. John, you were mentioning before we went on the air, you've been in your job more than 20 years. How long has this been on your radar? I know this report came out in December, but it's not new in some ways.
It's not new because the trucking industry has been a leader in adopting technology for a very long time. Some of the things that we see in cars now were in trucks a long time ago. You know, doing things like forward crash mitigation, meaning how do you use sonar and LiDAR and things like that to determine the distance with the car. Trucks have been putting those on as options for a number of years now. Technology that helps us understand when we're departing a lane, and it sends off signals when we're going too fast around a curve, even GPS, tracking the truck where it's at. We've been very much advanced leaders with using technology.
Steve, there was a moment in October, just a few months ago, when a truck filled with Budweiser beer built by the company Otto made its first delivery for Anheuser-Busch with a self-driving truck. It was in Colorado, went from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs. And there's a video about this, which I tweeted it earlier out. They very dramatically got the driver out of the seat. There was no one in the driver's seat. To the point that John made about earlier innovations and where we go next, how drastic is that?
Well, I would echo John's point that, the trucking industry has been an innovator in a number of areas, and they're not resistant to technology, which is sometimes the way that this gets framed is that, trucking is a conservative industry, and now we have these disruptors coming in and, with new big data technology and automation, and what's going to be the consequence of that if trucking doesn't catch up or develop a new attitude. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. But these are new technologies. We have things that look similar, but the ability for self-driving trucks to change the operations of trucking firms are really substantial, and I think they are going to require some new kinds of thinking and processes, within companies, not just for trucking companies, but also for shippers, and there are going to be big policy implications as well that we're going to have to think through.
I was reading through articles about this, John. There's an article from 2015 with this headline, which I liked. Self-driving trucks are going to hit us like a human-driven truck. Is that true, though? Do you feel the hair on the back of your neck sticking up when you think about what's coming for the trucking industry?
I think the trucking industry is always, looking for the next thing it can use to better serve its customers and do it safely. So I think a lot of these technologies we've talked about really have a lot of safety advantages, and I think that's a really important piece. Everything the trucking industry thinks about in terms of what they're going to adopt is through that lens. And I think the other thing about just the whole topic is, and I like the word that Steve used, we're talking about self-driving vehicles, not driverless. I don't think the trucking industry as a whole is talking about let's remove the truck driver from the truck. The job is going to change. It can, change significantly depending on what type of operation it's doing. But we see that the truck driver is still going to be an integral component of how freight gets delivered. And let's put it in context. In Minnesota, 78% of all manufactured tons are delivered by trucks. 68% of Minnesota communities rely exclusively on trucks for delivery. So the trucks are going to be there, and technology will be part of it, but the driver's not going away.
So the 3 million number we hear, your estimation, John, as we sit here today, is that those 3 million, a majority of them won't lose their jobs if all of the trucking fleets turn over to self-driving in the next 10 years?
Well, all the trucking fleets won't turn over to self-driving for a number of reasons. One, we don't really know exactly how it's going to work yet in the real world. We have governmental regulations. We have public perception. We have
that's a big one.
We do. We have an ROI that people have to figure out whether this thing can really work, and fundamentally trucking is not all the same. So what often gets talked about is the example of the beer delivery, which was largely on an interstate on an open route, but trucking is not one type of thing. If you're delivering sand and gravel, that's counted in the truck driver head count. If you're delivering parcels, that's covered in the truck driver head count. Let's take a look at these large, wind generator components, the large fins. Those are
with oversized loads.
With
right?
oversized
they're going
loads.
down the highway, and you got to watch out for
They're
them.
never going to be automated. I just don't see that. I think the path probably going forward is more akin to an airline pilot for some operations, meaning, they're going to be involved with getting in cityscape driving, getting loads loaded on. Maybe once they're in an environment where it can travel more freely, that automation will assist that driver. But then when they've got to deliver and get back into a cityscape, the driver's going to take on that role. So I think the thing is, the technology is definitely there to do things. I think the technology is sort of overhyped what the technology can do and oversimplified the labor concerns that are part of this.
Well, and in that video I tweeted out about the Budweiser delivery, they got their PR office. They did a very nice video about it. But one of the lines in there was, look, there's still a trucker in the truck because he or she has to actually load the load. They were there at the beginning, putting the beer in the truck. And then once they got on the highway is when they turned it on, to your point earlier about putting it on autopilot.
Well, absolutely. There are critical things that the truck driver must do en route. Again, some of these are driven by regulation, some are by reality. Sometimes you have to fuel en route. You have to fuel. Yeah. Sometimes you have to check that load. What if you have a breakdown? How do you attend to that?
Steve, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, though. There's a lot of conversations about automation. And frankly, in the world today, there are a lot of conversations about lost jobs in the world and a lot of public angst against things like trade deals. To what extent does automation, though, actually play that role?
Well, automation in other industries has had, a substantial effect, and we can think about travel agents or, manufacturing workers who've been replaced through automation. I do think the long-term, issue is going to be around how much productivity gain can we get out of autonomous or self-driving trucks. Again, even if the driver is still there. By definition, if we have, significant increases in productivity, we're going to see less labor required to perform that work.
Yeah. And
we're going to see some job loss.
There will be job losses. I mean, John, here in Minnesota, with the coal mining, or not the coal mining, the iron ore mining in northern Minnesota, when those mines are fully open, and they weren't for a while, so that was its own problem. But when they are at full employment, that full employment number is a vastly smaller number of actual miners than it was back in the 80s. So, maybe I shouldn't have said in the intro that all 3 million will be gone, but this is going to hurt at some point, isn't it?
Well, it'll hurt, but it can also help. Again, it can change the nature of the job. So I think Steve's right. You have some opportunity for productivity gains, but what else can that driver then be doing? And I think the issue with the number of jobs to be lost is the economy continues to grow. As the economy grows and we make more things, there are more things to haul, and there is just the need for more freight than to be hauled by something. So the question is, what's your starting number and where are you ending?
John Houselouden with me from the Minnesota Trucking Association. Steve Viselli here as well from Penn, a sociologist there, an economic and political sociologist. And we're taking your questions here. We're talking specifically about automation in the trucking industry, which has been getting a lot of notice of late. There was that Obama White House report. But as John noted, it's not it's not a new topic per se. Inviting your questions as well and your experiences. Maybe you get your job as a driver as well. What are your thoughts on how to address it? Where do you see automation in your work? Where do you see this going? 1-800-242-2828. You can tweet me at WeberTom1. Steve is on the phone here in St. Paul, and I think has truck driving in your career as well. Is that correct, Steve?
That is very correct.
Your thoughts here today?
I saw so many things while I was driving, and the problems I had driving city delivery for a private company in St. Paul, or I should say out of Bloomington, and some of the stunts that people would do. In fact, I've got one right here in front of me where all of a sudden a woman just popped up out of nowhere and decided her and her dog were going to cross a busy street. And they all of a sudden had to stop and slam on their brakes. How well would that automated vehicle handle that situation? I can't see it doing it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for the call. John, what do you know about the question that Steve just asked about how good it is? My understanding is the technology is pretty good in a lot of ways, but what do you know about it?
Well, there's a whole range of technology that we're talking about here, and part of it is some of the technology, relies on what it can see, right? If you have inclement weather conditions like in Minnesota winters, things like, radar and LiDAR or cameras, they're all things that can mess that up. So there's some challenges about that working. You get in a more congested cityscape environment and you got a lot more things processing through. That's a challenge. So in the best situation, can the technology demonstrate that it can do it? Yes. Are we at a point right now where we could, like we said, go to a downtown area and deliver like that? That's a challenge. And again, let's face it, it's Minnesota. Mm-hmm. Snow comes, all of a sudden there's a snowbank that you didn't plan on being there.
And Steve, in general, what we're talking about is sensors on the sides of the vehicles using GPS and a whole bunch of technologies to, if someone does step out into traffic, do those sensors pick it up? There is a lot to be said, though, for the reaction time of computers versus the reaction time of human drivers. How is that sorting itself out right now on the technology, Steve?
Well, I think the big area that we're going to see some improvements in is really along the lines of the stuff that John was talking about earlier, which is assisting the human driver in making decisions and in being aware of their environment. So, sensors that can alert you to somebody in your blind spot, right? These sorts of things that we already have available on vehicles, or forward-looking radars that can tell you, whether or not you are likely to have a collision. These are the sorts of things that are going to be developing and being implemented increasingly over time. But we are still a significant ways away from any local driving environment being navigable using autonomous vehicles. Now, on the over-the-road side of things, on the long-haul segments of trips on the interstate, that's where we could see, an increasing use of self-driving vehicles. Again, the driver's still going to be there in most of the cases for the next 5 to 10 years. Now, the big thing that I think you're going to see on the roads that people are going to notice is platooning, which is probably the most immediately impactful of the kind of futuristic technologies that's really almost here now.
What is that?
So platooning is a situation. So the challenge with self-driving cars is making the decisions that a human driver is going to make. And we just don't have computers that are capable of processing the amount of data that they're going to need from all of these sensors, which send back a tremendous amount of data. That's going to remain a challenge, making those driving decisions that come quite naturally and easily to human beings. As the lead vehicle, if you will, in this platoon. So what you're going to see is essentially a convoy of trucks behind a truck being driven by a human being. And those drone trucks, if you will, are going to have the very simple task of following that lead truck and taking acceleration and braking information or directions from that lead truck. Now, you're still going to have a driver in that following truck, but you're not going to have any labor savings potentially, but unless we change regulatory rules around hours of service. But you're going to get a lot of fuel savings very quickly, as much as 10% for those following trucks. And that's going to really change the return on investment for this kind of technology.
So that sounds like drafting without actually going out and flipping ahead like you see in racing. What were you going to add to that, John?
Yeah, and I would agree platooning is something that is certainly just more doable because of the technology. One of the things that and it's been demonstrated in Europe. They're doing demonstration tests, in the United States to show this as well. Peloton is a company that's doing a lot of that. And I think one of the challenges of that model, though, is most trucking companies don't have multiple trucks going down the same road to the same vendors at the same time.
They're fanning out in all different directions.
Right. So this technology assumes that trucking companies are going to participate and cooperate by going in the queue with somebody else's driver from some other company to take advantage of the fuel savings or the reduced fatigue on the driver or whatever that might be. Well, that's a whole nother hurdle that we have. So the technology, again, proves it can be done in the practical business world. Again, with where drivers are going and what they're doing, we have yet to begin to have serious conversations about how that's going to work.
And not for nothing, just to give people listening an idea here of the importance in terms of job numbers, NPR, National Public Radio, in 2015 made a map of the most common job in every state, and it went through 1978 to 2014, and it was one of these animated things where you see the map change every second. Since 1998, the truck driver in Minnesota has been the most common job throughout the whole state. And it's actually, the truck driver is the most common job in more than a majority of the states today. One reason for that is because that includes, it's a very large category. It includes delivery truck and big rigs and things like that. So that's one reason for it. But just to give people a sense of what we're talking about here. As well. Back to the phones here. Tim is in Edina with a comment here today. Tim, go right ahead.
So I think we need to look at this from a generational standpoint. If you look back a generation, we didn't have any of this technology. A generation from now, it's almost inconceivable to try and dream up what we'll have. And you overlay on top of that companies' desire to operate their businesses as cheaply as possible. I think we need to look at this from a societal point of view. There are going to be a ton of jobs lost. You just said it's the most, the biggest job in Minnesota. There are going to be a ton of jobs lost. What are we doing now to start helping those people when it's less expensive for us to do it now, to retrain them and redirect them so that when we have this problem in a generation, we're not addressing it as if it's day one? How are we looking ahead to this?
That is the million-dollar question, Tim. I'm glad. I couldn't have worded it any better, so I'm glad you called, because that is the question I wanted to pivot to, John. You and Steve have both said this isn't going to happen tomorrow. Great. So we have some time. So what's happening now?
Well, I think trucking companies are all just sitting down, with their own teams and trying to understand what the opportunity is, what the benefits could be, what that looks like going forward. So it's pretty new in the conversation, but I think what we've already identified is the technology is going to create new jobs and different jobs. If you have a bunch of trucks, and let's say you got to a point where you had a truck that didn't have a driver in it, well, now you've created a whole greater demand for who's going to handle that freight at different points along the way. You've created a new level.
Couldn't that be a robot?
Could be a robot, I guess, but again, some of the unique things about how freight is handled. And
what I want to get your sense, though, is in every other industry where we've seen automation, and I'm thinking of mining on the Iron Range, the net result has been job loss. And you still have mining on the Iron Range, but it's done at whatever capacity by fewer humans. And so can that be staved off in trucking the way it has not been staved off in every other industry that's seen automation? Or do you expect that this will have a body blow to trucking in terms of jobs?
Well, I don't think right now the industry is has an overall strategy to stave off technology. Again, I think we've said a couple times, the goal is to figure out how does the technology help us serve our customers, deliver the product safely, and technology will certainly play a role in that. So, there could be some job loss because the technology serves those functions well. But again, we go back to you can't fundamentally remove the driver from the equation. And again, the first mile and last mile are the biggest challenge. And so do jobs migrate? Do they go from long haul? Do they go to more local and regional? That's one of the strategies that, could certainly be employed.
Steve, go back to that question on the phone. What is or should be done now is, since you both have noted this isn't happening tomorrow, the caller was right. If we have some time, what do we do now? What conversations do we have now about how to be ready for it?
Well, we're in a bit of a catch-22 because I do think that the public attention to this question is very useful and important, and we want to sustain the public's attention. The problem is that we have a relatively simplistic set of alternatives that are being proposed of kind of, minimum basic income for all the workers displaced after they have no jobs, or sort of resisting this technology. And it's going to be an incremental process of, again, increased productivity based on where it makes sense within these operations and provides a real return. But we need to be thinking about, as that White House report suggested, the context into which this automation or these automated technologies are going. And so if we look at automation in manufacturing, there has been a lot of pain to a lot of communities who had job losses as a result of automation. Now, I would say, if we look at the auto industry, we've had that pain despite the fact that labor had a strong voice in that industry historically, still retains a significant voice. It's diminished, but labor was able to shape the way that technology was introduced in many cases, and had a private social safety net of agreements with the big automakers and others to ensure that workers weren't taking the brunt of these impacts. Trucking is a very different situation in which we don't have a lot of labor voice, particularly on the over-the-road side of the industry, and we already have some less than attractive labor processes, including public subsidy of training and very high turnover, and millions of people who've been trained to work in the industry who currently aren't working in the industry. And so the point that the White House report brings out really clearly is that, if this technology is introduced in the wrong way, it's going to be bad for workers. And we've seen that lesson over and over again.
Well, and the other thing we've seen, Steve, is policymakers, lawmakers going to a default answer in other industries of saying, well, if this is changing, then we got to get them training and more education and 20 weeks of training to get into the next job. Has that worked? Is that realistic going forward? That's been said so many times. I feel like there's a public guffawing of the idea in some ways. Why is that?
So first of all, we don't spend a lot on worker retraining. We don't have a robust set of programs for worker training, again, as the report pointed out. I've actually had a couple of research assistants for the last few months trying to figure out just what we spend on worker retraining and what might be going to the trucking industry, for instance, or other industries. We don't even have good data on the outcomes and the effectiveness of worker training.
And like Germany, for example, gets a lot of credit because they appear to be doing something completely different and with a lot more success.
Absolutely. And I think the public is right to kind of snicker with the idea that we're going to take workers who have, a high school education and they're maybe 40 years old, and we're going to retrain them to do the high-tech jobs that might spin off of this, requiring computer programming training or something like this. These are not, that we need to have a more sophisticated debate about what worker retraining in response to automation should look like.
By the way, the other option you talked about, the universal basic income, it's this idea, and some countries in Scandinavia, I think, are experimenting with this. It's the idea that so many people might be without a job in the future. The future of work is so unknown that universal basic income is just an income you get as a new safety net. That's actually going to be a conversation at noon, so stay with MPR News on that as well. What would you add to that, John? Not the universal basic income, but what Steve was just talking about with training and getting a crop of people ramped up to the next job, whatever it is.
Well, I think the thing to remember about people who are truck drivers today, these are incredibly adaptable, flexible, smart, forward-thinking people, because driving truck is a complex task today. And so let's not minimize the opportunity for these people to take on new roles within the industry, new roles within captaining these new types of ships that we call trucks, or having the capacity to take those skills into other industries. But our goal is, we think people who are in trucking, they do it because they have a passion, because they care, because there's a legacy, there's an understanding, and moving goods to unique locations with unique customers is a very complex process that can't simply be automated. There's still going to be a key role for many people in this industry, and so the driver role is going to evolve.
Paradoxically, is there actually also currently a shortage of drivers?
There is a shortage of drivers, but it's how many loads are people trying to get, and can they get that load moved that day? But yes, right now, the American Trucking Association says there's about a $45,000 shortage of drivers.
45,000 person or you said dollar?
Person.
Okay, person.
But
shortage.
But that's a definition of loads trying to be placed. I mean, right now we're moving all the freight, right?
Right.
I mean, fundamentally, the freight's being moved. The question is how fast and under what mode, but we're getting it all moved.
Do you ever think about how you're 45,000 people short right now? If you got to full employment, you could be setting yourself up for a problem down the road if there are in fact job losses as automation comes on. I'm spinning around in my head when I think about that.
Right. Well, I think the challenge of every industry today, trucking not alone, is finding workers to do the job, that do it well, and so that's why automation is going to play a role, because there are pieces that it can solve, and so we think about that. And as we said, if you had asked us a few years ago, would we be having a conversation of this level about automation, we would have said, that's a bit further down the road, but it's certainly sooner upon us than we expected.
Well, the good people of, I'm trying to remember what town in Colorado got their beer that day from a self-driving truck.
Well, I got to tell you, the Anheuser-Busch people knew what they were doing when they picked a beer truck, because you get beer in the equation and people pay attention.
That got a lot of news stories.
Right.
I know you know that as well. Let's go back to the phones here. Harold is in St. Paul. Hi, Harold. Go right ahead.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure. Your thoughts.
I am a taxi driver in St. Paul, and part of what we do are what we call account calls or insurance calls, where the insurance company is covering the fare. And one of the things that I do when I pick up a passenger is turn around, talk to them, and verify that I've got the correct passenger and verify that I'm taking them to the correct address. Because the way things are right now, human error does occur. And sometimes the wrong address gets entered into the system, or sometimes the insurance company sends over the wrong information to our company. And we cannot arbitrarily take somebody to a different address just because it's got entered wrong, because there's all kinds of federal funds involved. So we just can't take somebody to address they say they need to go to unless it's in our system. So unless your automatic or your automaton can do that and verify that, I don't think it's going to work for what I do.
And what you're talking about, Harold, is you're actually talking about the point where the part of your job that is automated, getting a fare in some cases, meets the unautomated part. And if you don't have a human there to verify, that could be a problem. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
That's really an interesting point there, Steve. Are we always going to have that point of transition between the automated part of the job and the unautomated, for which we're never going to lose jobs because you're always going to need a human? Thoughts?
Yeah, and I think, I would echo John's, point about the complexity of some of the driving, or some of the parts of the job. The question is, what parts can be automated? So, think about a taxi driver, and this is something we're encountering right now with ride sharing, is a taxi driver understands dangerous situations for passenger pickup and drop off, for instance. They know to what the safer locations near the curb to drop someone off are. And so there's going to be decision making that is based on experience that professionals do in any industry, that it's going to be very hard to automate, especially in complex environments like urban situations. But there are also going to be, that lane maintenance, don't hit the car in front of you kind of routine driving that's done on a predictable highway situation, which is where we're seeing, right, these demonstrations happening, is in these relatively controlled or controllable and predictable environments. And that's going to be where automation is going to have the effect. And I would just add on the platooning situation. Mm-hmm. The one of Peloton, the company that's developing its partners, is Omnitrax, and Omnitrax, produces a satellite-linked communication system that many of the big carriers use, and that's how that vehicle-to-vehicle communication across companies is going to be happening potentially in the next few years. And I think so. The solutions for some of these problems are, when the return on investment's there, the solution is gonna be forthcoming, I think.
John, what do you see your role as an industry advocate? Is the role writ large of someone like you, with all of these changes coming, to be the guy who says, heck no, we won't go? Or is your job to foam the runway and make that transition into whatever's coming smoother?
Oh, as an organization, our job is to make sure our members understand what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and to bring them together to have those conversations. Because as we said, there's a lot of public policy implications of what this means. And I think a lot of this has been driven by the technology companies today, and I think their preference would be, let's just sort of go state by state, let's establish a beachhead, and let's get it going wherever we can. Mm-hmm. And as an industry, we need to say, slow down. This is interstate commerce. We can't have different states having different regulations. There's this whole issue Steve talked about, communication. There's a debate right now about the 5.9 gigahertz frequency for communications. The government is looking at opening that up and letting it not be used just for safety. So
these are radio waves you're talking about.
Yeah, the ability for the vehicle to communicate with each other, with the infrastructure. So the point is, as an organization, we need to we bring speakers into our members, we're educating them, we're starting to have those conversations, and then say, so what's the best policy from a public policy perspective that allows us to take advantage of it, doesn't create barriers, but doesn't force things upon us that we're not ready to do.
Just give me a quick list of the other policy things to think about. I know you talked about, like, for example, the rules about when a driver has to come off the road for resting, right? You can only drive so many hours a day. Does that go away because you can just be in the truck sleeping the whole time if it's a self-driving truck?
These sort of driver-based regulations are going to have to be looked at because, right, if the driver's in the truck and not driving, whether they're doing other work or potentially even sleeping, we're not there yet. That's a different calculation, but it certainly changes. All of those rules are to make sure the driver is refreshed and able to do the job well. Mm-hmm. Well, technology is going to change that dynamic. Cybersecurity, now having access to trucks that are fully automated, or at least a driver who is in the truck. How do you manage that? So cybersecurity, liability. This is the big thing that is still, what happens if there's a crash? Who is going to be liable and how are we going to work that out? And the technology companies are pretty quick to say, well, we're confident our stuff's going to work, so it's somebody else. But I think that's going to be a big barrier to get through before you're going to see full embracing, because those have huge implications.
Not for nothing, I got a tweet asking whether I consider my job on the radio protected from automation. And at this point, I have no idea. That's its own conversation, and I wouldn't pretend to know what's coming even in my industry as well. But it's an interesting conversation. I'm sure we'll have you back for sure to talk about this more, because change is coming for sure, John. But thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Right. Thank you.
John Hauseladen from the Minnesota Trucking Association and Steve Viselli from the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
More online at NPR News.